My name is Piper Reynolds. I am 31 years old. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in July, I walked into my parents' house in Plano, Texas, carrying a cardboard box that held the last 6 years of my corporate life. I had just been laid off from my job as a senior financial auditor. But the real shock was not losing my career. The real shock was the sight waiting for me in the front hallway. 3 heavy-duty black contractor bags sat neatly lined up against the baseboards. They were bulging with my clothes, my shoes, and my personal files. My mother Valerie stepped out of the kitchen. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt and smelled sharply of expensive lavender room spray. She did not ask why I was home early. She did not ask why I was carrying a box of office supplies. She simply pointed to the trash bags and delivered a sentence I will never forget. Sutton needs your room for her boutique inventory, so you will need to find somewhere else to crash tonight. I did not drop my box. I did not scream. I just stood there realizing my expiration date in this family had arrived the exact minute my perceived utility vanished. Before I take you back through the events of that day, take a second to subscribe to Calm Senior Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from right now. I read every single one. Now let me bring you back to the beginning of that Tuesday. The temperature in Dallas hit 104 degrees, the kind of Texas heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the air feel heavy to breathe. My morning started in a glass conference room. Human resources took exactly 9 minutes to dissolve my position. They used sterile words like restructuring and downsizing to explain why my badge stopped working. I drove my practical sedan north on the tollway back to the sprawling brick house my parents owned, or rather the house they appeared to own. I had moved back into that guest room 6 months prior, supposedly, to help them navigate a financial rough patch. I thought I was being a good daughter. When I pushed open the heavy oak front door, the cool central air conditioning rushed over me. Then I saw the bags. The plastic was thick, the kind you buy for yard waste, tied tight at the top. I set my cardboard box on the entryway console. I looked at Valerie. She was casually adjusting a crystal vase on the hall table. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. "What is this?" She gave me a tight, impatient smile. "I just told you, Piper. Your sister has a shipment of imported dresses arriving tomorrow. Her launch party is this weekend. The guest room is the only space with decent natural light for her unboxing videos." I looked past her into the living room. My father Richard was sitting in his leather recliner. He turned a page of his Texas Monthly magazine. The paper crinkled loud and crisp in the quiet house. He did not stand up. He did not turn around. His silence was a familiar strategy. "You packed my life into garbage bags for an Instagram backdrop," I asked. Valerie sighed. "Do not be dramatic, Piper. You make 6 figures. Go book a hotel. Sutton is trying to build a brand. She needs our support right now." She said the word support without a trace of irony. I was an auditor. I spent my days identifying fraudulent assets and tracking broken ledgers. Standing in that hallway, I ran the numbers on my own life. I saw the deficit clearly. I was not a family member. I was just a tenant who had overstayed her welcome. I stood in the foyer with my arms wrapped around the cardboard box, holding my stapler, my framed degree, and my favorite ceramic coffee mug. I stared at the 3 heavy-duty black trash bags leaning against the wall. Before I could process the reality of being evicted on the worst day of my professional life, footsteps echoed on the hardwood stairs. My younger sister Sutton descended into the hallway. She was 27 years old and radiated the kind of effortless gloss that comes from never having to fund your own existence. She wore matching beige loungewear that cost more than my first vehicle. In one hand, she held an iced matcha latte. In the other, she held her smartphone. Her nails were freshly manicured in a pale pink shade, tapping rhythmically against the glass screen. She reached the bottom step and paused. She did not look at the cardboard box in my arms. She did not ask why I was home in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She looked only at the trash bags blocking her path to the kitchen. "You need to move these," Sutton said, gesturing vaguely with her phone. "The photographer is coming tomorrow to shoot the new inventory for the boutique. I cannot have garbage in the background of my videos." I set my box down on the entryway console. I looked at my sister, searching her face for any trace of familial empathy. "I was laid off today, Sutton. My entire department was eliminated this morning. Sutton blinked. Her expression remained blank, untouched by sympathy. Her mind was already processing the information through a single selfish filter. "Wait!" she said, her voice tightening with genuine panic. "If you are unemployed, who is going to cover my $1,200 Tahoe lease this month?" I shifted my gaze to the living room. My father, Richard, was sitting in his large leather recliner. He held a copy of Texas Monthly magazine. I could see the rigid line of his jaw. He heard every word. He always heard every word. But Richard had a lifelong strategy for household conflict. He vanished into silence. He turned a glossy page. The crisp rustle of paper was his only contribution to the conversation. I stared at the back of his leather chair and felt a cold wave of clarity wash over me. That rustling sound transported me back to my 22nd birthday. I was fresh out of college, working grueling junior hours at a downtown accounting firm. My mother had called me crying about a sudden spike in their property taxes. I wired them $600 that very afternoon. I thought it was a one-time emergency. I was young. I did not understand that I was establishing a precedent. The emergency never ended. It simply evolved. Over the next 9 years, that initial transfer mutated into a permanent tax on my existence. I paid for a broken water heater. I covered the veterinary bills for a dog I did not own. When Sutton decided she wanted to spend a semester studying abroad in Milan, I was the one who funded her weekend excursions because my parents claimed their liquidity was temporarily tied up. I was never a daughter to them. I was a recurring direct deposit. I was the reliable safety net that allowed them to live miles beyond their actual means. While I ate packed lunches at my desk and lived in a modest apartment to save for a down payment, Sutton received a brand new luxury sport utility vehicle. Valerie joined a higher tier at the local country club. Richard upgraded his golf clubs. My diligence funded their delusions. They viewed my professional success not as something to celebrate, but as an expanding budget for their own desires. "Piper, are you listening to me?" Sutton asked, snapping her fingers to pull my attention back to the present. Her tone was sharp and demanding. "The payment process is on Friday. If it bounces, my credit score will tank. You promised you would handle it until the boutique turned a profit." I had promised no such thing. I had simply surrendered to Valerie and her relentless guilt trips 3 months ago. Valerie had cornered me in the kitchen, claiming Sutton just needed a tiny bridge loan to launch her brand. A tiny bridge loan that somehow required a leased luxury vehicle to maintain an image. "I cannot run a lifestyle brand if I am driving a 10-year-old sedan." Sutton continued gesturing towards the driveway where my reliable car was parked. "It ruins the aesthetic. You have severance pay, right? Just transfer the funds before you leave today." Before I leave today. The words hung in the air, heavy and clear. They were throwing me out onto the street, but they still expected me to leave my wallet on the kitchen counter. The sheer entitlement did not break my heart. It rewired it. As a senior financial auditor, my job was to examine failing companies. I looked for the exact point where a business model became unsustainable. I searched for the toxic assets. Standing in the foyer of that beautiful home, I audited my own family. The result was glaring. They were not sad that I had lost my job. They did not care about my career trajectory or my emotional well-being. They were simply frustrated that their personal automated teller machine was out of order. They were treating my unemployment like a mechanical failure that inconvenienced their weekend plans. Valerie walked back into the hallway holding a stack of shipping labels. She sidestepped my cardboard box as if it were a puddle of mud. "Sutton is right," Valerie said smoothly. "You need to honor your commitments, Piper. We cannot have Sutton stressed before her launch party. Stress makes her break out. Just wire the money and we can all move forward." Move forward. That was Valerie and her favorite phrase. It meant ignoring the damage she inflicted and focusing solely on what she wanted next. She stood there in her crisp white tennis skirt, demanding I subsidize the very sister who was currently taking my bed. I looked at the three of them. Sutton glaring at her phone. Valerie holding her shipping labels. Richard hiding behind a magazine about barbecue joints. For nearly a decade, I had absorbed their demands. I had swallowed my resentment because I believed that compliance would eventually earn me their love. I thought if I just paid enough, helped enough, solved enough problems, They would finally look at me the way they looked at Sutton. But conditional love is just a transaction disguised as affection, and the invoice had finally come due. I realized I owed them nothing. The debt was a fabrication. I did not argue. Arguing with Valerie was a losing game. It gave her fuel. It allowed her to play the victim. Instead, I leaned down and grabbed the thick plastic strings of the first heavy-duty trash bag. It weighed perhaps 40 pounds, filled with my winter coats and tailored business suits. The plastic stretched under the strain. I hauled it over my shoulder. "Where are you going?" Sutton asked, sounding annoyed that I was not pulling out my banking application. "I am moving my garbage out of your background," I replied. My voice was steady. It did not shake. It held the flat, emotionless tone I used during hostile corporate audits. I carried the first bag out the front door. The brutal Texas heat hit my face, a stark contrast to the chilled air conditioning inside. I popped the trunk of my car and shoved the bag inside. I walked back for the second, then the third. My father never lowered his magazine. My mother simply watched me, her arms crossed, waiting for me to capitulate. She expected me to pause at the door to apologize for being an inconvenience, to ask for their bank routing number. That was the script we had followed for years. But the script was changing. As I carried my cardboard box of office supplies out to the passenger seat, I looked back at the sprawling brick house, the manicured lawn, the tall oak trees framing the wide driveway. My parents believed they were standing inside a fortress of their own making. They believed they held all the power. They were so confident in their perceived wealth and social status. They did not know that their fortress was built on paper. They did not know about the legal document sitting in a secure safety deposit box at a bank in downtown Dallas. A document bearing my signature. They were throwing me out of a house they believed they owned, blissfully oblivious to the fact that their financial reality was an illusion I had been quietly funding. I shut my car door. I put the engine in gear. I did not wire Sutton her $1,200. I did not say goodbye. I simply drove away, watching the house shrink in my rearview mirror, knowing they were about to learn the true cost of their entitlement. I steered my sedan onto the entrance ramp of the Dallas North Tollway. The late afternoon sun beat down through the windshield, baking the dark dashboard, but I shivered inside the air-conditioned cabin. I did not turn on the radio. I needed the quiet. The rhythmic thumping of the tires against the concrete highway provided a steady metronome for my racing thoughts. As I drove farther south, the sprawling estates and perfectly manicured lawns of Plano gave way to the towering glass facades of corporate business parks. I was leaving behind the pristine neighborhood where my parents projected their flawless image to the world. I had lived in their guest room for 6 months, believing I was providing essential support during a difficult financial season for them. Now my entire existence was stuffed into garbage bags sliding around in my trunk. I exited the tollway and pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, nondescript business hotel. It was the kind of place catering to traveling sales representatives and exhausted consultants. The lobby smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. I checked in at the front desk, handed over my credit card, and received a magnetic key card for a room on the 4th floor. It took 3 grueling trips to carry the heavy black plastic bags and my cardboard box of office supplies up the slow elevator. When I finally dropped the last load onto the commercial-grade carpet of room 412, I locked the deadbolt. I slid the metal security latch into place. For the first time all day, I was truly alone. The hotel suite was sterile and beige. It featured a generic painting of a landscape on the wall, a neat king-sized bed, and a laminate desk facing a large window overlooking the concrete parking garage. The room lacked any warmth, yet it felt safer than the luxurious brick fortress I had just escaped. The humming air conditioning unit offered a dull, continuous drone that masked the traffic noise outside. I sat down on the edge of the stiff mattress. My shoulders ached from hauling the heavy bags. I reached into my purse and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was dark. I tapped the glass to wake it up, expecting a flurry of notifications. I thought maybe my father would have sent a gruff, uncomfortable text, asking if I made it to a safe location. I thought maybe my mother would send a demanding message requiring I return to apologize for upsetting my sister. There was nothing. 0 missed calls, Zero new messages. The silence was deafening. It echoed louder than any screaming match we ever had in that house. If a child leaves home abruptly with their life packed in trash bags, normal parents worry. Normal parents call to ensure their child is not sleeping in a car on the side of the highway. My parents did not care if I was safe. Their silence proved my hypothesis. Because I had refused to pay Sutton her $1,200 car lease, my utility had dropped to zero. Therefore, my physical safety was irrelevant. They were not punishing me with silence. They simply had no use for me until the first of the month rolled around again. When I was a teenager, Valerie frequently used the silent treatment as a psychological leash. If I achieved a grade she deemed insufficient, or if I failed to enthusiastically attend one of her high society luncheons, she would simply look through me. She would serve dinner to Richard and Sutton while leaving my place setting empty. It was a calculated starvation of affection designed to force my compliance. I always broke first. I always drafted the tearful apology promising to try harder, pledging to be the exact version of the daughter she required. She was running the exact same play right now. She believed leaving me alone in a cheap motel would strip away my defiance. She assumed the isolation would slowly crush my spirit until I willingly handed over the corporate severance package they so desperately coveted. They expected the silence to break me. Instead, it provided the exact unbroken focus I needed. I did not cry. Crying requires a reserve of emotional energy I no longer possessed. Instead, my professional training took over. I stood up, walked over to the laminate desk, and unpacked my laptop from my leather tote bag. I plugged the charger into the wall socket and booted up the machine. As an auditor, I process trauma the same way I process corporate malfeasance. I rely on hard data. I search for hidden patterns. In the corporate world, when a company hemorrhages cash while projecting an image of unshakable prosperity, you look for the buried liabilities. You trace the flow of capital to understand the true hierarchy of the organization. My family operated on the exact same principles. They were a failing enterprise running on a deficit of empathy and a surplus of unearned entitlement. Sitting in that uncomfortable desk chair, staring at the glowing screen of my computer, a profound shift occurred inside my chest. I stopped viewing myself as a discarded, unloved child. I shed the heavy, suffocating skin of the dutiful daughter. I adopted the cold, analytical detachment of a forensic investigator. The tactical silence my family deployed was intended to act as a crucible meant to melt down my resolve and reshape me into a compliant cash machine. Instead, the intense heat of their rejection burned away the last lingering illusions I held about our relationship. I realized their conditional love was nothing more than a fabricated debt. It was a phantom ledger they created the day I was born, an ongoing tally of expectations I could never satisfy. No matter how many problems I solved, no matter how many bills I quietly paid, the balance would never reach zero. They designed the system specifically to keep me in the red. Sutton was born a creditor. I was born a debtor. Her mere existence was celebrated while my strenuous efforts were merely expected and quickly forgotten. Once I identified the debt as a fabrication, the lingering guilt in my stomach evaporated. It was replaced by a sharp, focused determination. My parents believed they held all the leverage because they controlled the guest room in Plano. They thought casting me out would sever my access to their prestigious social circle, isolating me from the only world they deemed valuable. They were remarkably arrogant, blinded by their own manufactured vanity and neighborhood status. They failed to account for my memory. They forgot that I never threw anything away, especially not financial records. Richard and Valerie operated under the assumption that I would simply absorb this latest injury and eventually crawl back checkbook in hand, eager to purchase my reinstatement into the family. They severely miscalculated the strength of a woman who had just lost her career and realized she actually lost nothing of personal value. I connected the laptop to the unsecured hotel wireless network. I established a secure virtual private network tunnel to ensure my digital footprint remained hidden from any potential monitoring. I was done absorbing their damage. I was done padding their frequent falls. The silence they granted me was a monumental strategic error on their part. It granted me the time and space to prepare a devastating counteroffensive. They wanted to treat our relationship like a ruthless business transaction. I was finally ready to oblige them on those exact terms. To dismantle their false empire, I needed to review the historical data. I needed to quantify the exact extent of their exploitation to validate my upcoming actions. I opened my file explorer and navigated past the folders containing my recent resume updates and professional reference letters. I bypassed the standard documents and targeted a specific hidden directory I had meticulously updated for nearly a decade. I was about to audit my own history, setting the stage for a revelation that would shatter their fragile suburban fortress. I double-clicked a hidden icon on my desktop, entering a complex alphanumeric password I memorized years ago. The screen briefly went dark before illuminating the sterile, grid-lined interface of an Excel document. I titled the file simply as Family Ledger. I started this document shortly after my 22nd birthday. In those early years, Valerie had a habit of gaslighting my financial contributions. Whenever I dared to bring up how much I was helping, she would wave her manicured hand and claim I was exaggerating the amounts. She would insist Sutton was pulling her own weight despite the reality that my younger sister had never held a steady paycheck. Human memory is fragile and highly subject to emotional manipulation. Numbers, however, are immune to guilt trips. They do not lie and they do not forget. So I built a tracking system. I needed hard, undeniable evidence to validate my own sanity against their constant revisions of history. The spreadsheet glowed against the dim lighting of the hotel room. It contained hundreds of meticulously organized rows. The columns were labeled with clinical precision: date, requester, amount, stated reason, actual result. I scrolled through the chronological timeline of my 20s, watching my youth evaporate into a series of calculated wire transfers. Row 12 cataloged the genesis of this exploitation. I was 22, working grueling junior auditing hours, staring at spreadsheets until my eyes blurred. Valerie called me sobbing hysterically on a Thursday evening. She claimed a sudden, unexpected spike in their property taxes threatened their financial stability. She painted a picture of imminent ruin. I wired them $600 that very afternoon, skipping groceries for a week and eating instant oatmeal to make the math work on my end. I thought it was a one-time familial emergency. I felt proud to be the reliable daughter who could save the day. I did not realize I was establishing a dangerous precedent, proving my willingness to bleed for their comfort. Row 89 detailed the security deposit and first month of rent for Sutton and her downtown luxury apartment. My sister was 24 at the time, insisting she needed a premium zip code to properly network for her nebulous career goals. Valerie co-signed the lease but mysteriously lacked the liquid cash for the deposit, so the burden fell to me. Valerie framed it as an investment in Sutton's future, promising I would be paid back the moment the boutique concept took off. That repayment never arrived. Row 115 outlined an emergency flight I booked for my father. Richard claimed his vehicle broke down during a crucial business trip in Houston, and he needed immediate rescue to avoid losing a major client. I paid for a premium last-minute ticket. Months later, a careless comment from one of his country club associates revealed he had actually flown down for an exclusive golf tournament. He used my hard-earned cash to fund a weekend getaway playing 18 holes while I sat in a cubicle auditing corporate tax returns. Every single row represented a boundary they crossed with zero hesitation. Every cell contained a sacrifice I made under the heavy illusion of familial duty. While I ate packed lunches at my desk and lived in a modest, drafty apartment to save for a down payment, Sutton received a brand new luxury sport utility vehicle. Valerie joined a higher tier at the local tennis club, parading in pristine white skirts and sipping expensive wine. Richard upgraded his custom golf clubs and drank top-shelf scotch. My diligence funded their delusions. I navigated the clearance racks at discount department stores wearing sensible, outdated shoes to high-stakes board meetings just to ensure their bank accounts remained in the black. I was funding a country club lifestyle on a junior corporate salary. They viewed my professional success not as a milestone to celebrate, but as an expanding, unlimited budget for their own desires. They treated my promotions like dividend payouts for a company they did not own. I highlighted the entire column containing the financial figures, dragging my cursor from the very first entry down to the present day. I glanced at the automated sum generated in the bottom right corner of the monitor. $145,620. The number stared back at me, stark and irrefutable. That was my sunk cost. That money represented the European backpacking trip I never took. It was the down payment on a starter home I had to delay indefinitely. It was the sleepless nights calculating interest rates while earning a six-figure salary just to keep my own head above water. It was the physical manifestation of my stolen youth, quantified down to the exact penny. Staring at that specific six-figure sum, a profound shift occurred inside my chest. The simmering anger that had kept my spine rigid all afternoon finally burned out. A heavy bone-deep weariness rushed in to take its place. But beneath the fatigue, I felt something I had never experienced before in my entire life. Pure, unclouded clarity. For nearly a decade, I had been sprinting on a treadmill trying to reach a destination that did not exist. I kept thinking that if I just reached a certain dollar amount, they would finally validate my worth. I thought the next fabricated emergency would be the one that proved my loyalty and earned their unconditional love. The treadmill was finally unplugged. The silence of the hotel room was my emancipation. Have you ever kept a ledger of your heartbreaks? Tell me I am not the only one. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to calculate the exact cost of your family and their conditional affection. Tell me if you have ever had to measure your worth in wire transfers and canceled dreams just to keep the peace in your household. I read every single one, and I know I cannot be the only woman who subsidized a toxic dynamic, hoping for a return on investment that never came. I leaned back in the stiff hotel chair, letting the recycled air wash over me. My parents were currently sitting in their sprawling Plano estate, likely patting themselves on the back for handling my eviction so smoothly. They believed they held the ultimate authority over my living situation. They assumed they could discard me like broken furniture because they thought they understood the full extent of our financial entanglement. Richard and Valerie thought that $145,000 was my entire leverage. They believed my only power was the ability to cut off their allowance. They thought the worst thing I could do was simply stop paying Sutton's car lease. They were operating on outdated, incomplete intelligence. They forgot my actual profession. They forgot that I hunt for hidden liabilities for a living. They forgot that a truly skilled auditor always keeps two sets of books. I minimized the Excel spreadsheet, hiding the six-figure sum from view. The desktop wallpaper appeared, displaying a standard, uninteresting landscape. But in the bottom left corner, sitting unobtrusively among ordinary system files, was a locked, encrypted folder. I moved my mouse. I hovered the cursor over the icon. The folder was labeled Heritage. My parents kicked me out today because they believed they owned that sprawling brick fortress. They believed the deed belonged to them. They were very confident in their perceived kingdom. They were very wrong, and they were about to discover exactly who held the title to their false reality. I moved my cursor over the encrypted folder labeled Heritage. I double-clicked the icon, and a secondary security prompt materialized on the screen. This barrier required a complex alphanumeric string 1. I never wrote down and never stored in a password manager. I typed the sequence from memory and hit the Enter key. The directory unlocked. A single portable document format file sat inside. I opened it. The digital scan filled my monitor with dense paragraphs of contractual language, official county clerk stamps, and notarized signatures. The header at the top of the page read Notice of Assignment of Deed of Trust. My eyes scanned down to the principal balance line. $680,000. Below that numerical figure sat the legal description and the physical street address of the sprawling brick property in Plano. The irony was sharp and immediate. Valerie had stood in her pristine hallway just a few hours ago wearing her crisp tennis skirt, ordering me to vacate the premises. She pointed at my worldly possessions stuffed into garbage bags. She believed she possessed the supreme authority to evict me from her beautiful suburban sanctuary. She did not know the truth. She did not know that the sanctuary belonged to me. To understand how I became the secret architect of my parents' financial survival, you have to understand my paternal grandfather. Thomas Reynolds was a pragmatic, calloused man who built a regional freight logistics company from a single-use delivery truck. He wore faded denim jeans, drove a reliable domestic pickup, and treated money as a practical tool rather than a theatrical costume. He possessed a ruthless ability to read people. Grandpa Thomas watched his son Richard grow into a man obsessed with status. He watched my father prioritize country club initiation fees over retirement accounts. He watched Valerie lease European cars they could not afford just to impress neighbors they did not even like. My grandfather despised their pretense. He saw the fragile, hollow foundation beneath their projected wealth. When my grandfather passed away 5 years ago, the reading of his will delivered a seismic shock to my parents. Richard expected to inherit a thriving logistics empire and a vast portfolio of commercial real estate. Instead, the estate attorney handed my father a modest monthly stipend, tightly controlled by an independent executor. The bulk of the wealth bypassed my father entirely. It bypassed Sutton, whose entitlement had always mirrored our mother. Through a generation-skipping provision, the assets transferred directly into a private, irrevocable trust established solely in my name. I was 26 years old when I inherited a fortune. I did not buy a sports car. I did not upgrade my modest apartment. I kept my job as a junior auditor, packing my lunches and driving my sensible sedan. I understood that wealth requires a quiet discipline. If Richard and Valerie knew I possessed millions in liquid capital, they would have drained every cent to fund their illusions. I kept the Reynolds Heritage Trust a total secret. My silence proved crucial 2 years ago. Richard attempted to outsmart the market by securing high-interest bridge loans to fund a speculative commercial real estate venture. He thought he was a titan of industry. The venture collapsed spectacularly. Margin calls arrived. Lenders demanded immediate repayment. The financial dominoes toppled rapidly until they reached the front door of the Plano house. My parents fell 90 days behind on their primary mortgage. The original lender filed default notices. The threat of foreclosure became a ticking clock. Valerie entered a state of frantic denial. She started holding covert garage sales for designer handbags, pretending she was merely decluttering the closets. Richard stopped visiting the golf course. He hid in his leather recliner, nursing cheap liquor in expensive crystal glasses. They were terrified of losing their social standing. A foreclosure sign in the front yard would destroy the pristine image they spent decades cultivating. I watched them unravel. Despite their lifelong emotional neglect, I could not stomach the idea of them losing their home. I did not want them living in a motel. But I also knew that handing Richard a blank check would simply enable his reckless behavior. A direct bailout would teach them nothing. It would only reinforce their belief that someone else would always cover their debts. I scheduled a meeting with my wealth manager and lead attorney, Bennett. His office sat on the 32nd floor of a Dallas skyscraper featuring dark mahogany desks and sweeping views of the city skyline. I sat across from him, explaining my dilemma. I wanted to save my parents from homelessness, but I required a structural barrier to protect my own capital. Bennett proposed an elegant clinical solution. He introduced me to the mechanics of distressed debt. When a homeowner defaults on a mortgage, the original bank often wants to clear the bad debt from their balance sheet. They bundle these non-performing loans and sell them on the secondary market to private investors or hedge funds. They sell these notes at a steep discount to recoup a fraction of their losses quickly. Bennett leveraged his institutional connections to locate the specific portfolio containing my parents' mortgage. Through the Reynolds Heritage Trust, acting as a shielded corporate entity, I purchased the promissory note and the deed of trust on the Plano house. The remaining balance on their mortgage was $680,000. My trust acquired the legal rights to the debt for pennies on the dollar. I became their lender. I held the collateral. I owned the roof over their heads. The process was seamless and invisible. 2 weeks after the transaction cleared, a formal letter arrived in my parents' mailbox. The document notified them that their original bank had sold their mortgage to a private servicing company acting on behalf of an investment group. The letter offered a generous restructuring plan, lowering their monthly minimums and pausing the foreclosure proceedings. I vividly remember the evening they opened that letter. I was sitting at their dining room table eating a dry chicken breast, pretending I knew nothing. Valerie popped a bottle of imported champagne. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, boasting about his incredible luck. They did not express gratitude for their salvation. They treated the restructuring as a victory over the system. Richard bragged that he had successfully stalled the original bank long enough for a faceless corporate entity to sweep in and cut him a favorable deal. Valerie laughed, declaring that the universe always protected people of their social caliber. I sat across from them, sipping sparkling water. I watched my father toast to his own fabricated genius. I held the deed to his house in a filing cabinet downtown. I possessed the legal right to foreclose on their property with a single signature. Yet I chose to preserve their dignity. I let them believe they won. That was the context of my Tuesday afternoon. That was the hidden reality beneath the humiliating eviction. Valerie ordered me to pack my bags because Sutton required better natural lighting for a social media video. My mother tossed my belongings onto the front porch of a property she no longer controlled. She banished the only person standing between her and a cardboard box. The sheer audacity of their ignorance echoed in the quiet hotel room. I scrolled through the digital scan of the mortgage assignment. The legal jargon provided a comforting rhythm. The document proved that I was not a helpless daughter seeking approval. I was the primary lien holder. I closed the PDF reader. I took a deep breath, letting the sterile, recycled air of the hotel room fill my lungs. The initial shock of the day was fading, replaced by a cold operational focus. I resolved to simply walk away. I would leave them to their delusions. I would instruct Bennett to collect their monthly mortgage payments through the anonymous servicer, treating them as just another line item on my balance sheet. I would build my own life far away from their toxic orbit. I decided I would not seek revenge for the eviction. I would let the natural consequences of their financial habits catch up with them eventually. I reached for my smartphone, intending to set a morning alarm, so I could begin hunting for a new corporate auditing position. Before my finger touched the clock icon, the screen illuminated. A high-priority notification pushed through my lock screen. It was not a text message from Richard demanding money. It was not a guilt-tripping voicemail from Valerie. It was an automated security alert from my premier credit monitoring service. The banner glowed bright red against the dark display. The notification detailed a hard inquiry on my credit report. A hard inquiry is not a background check or a routine soft pull. It represents a finalized credit application. Someone had just successfully opened a new high-yield personal loan using my social security number. I stared at the glowing pixels. The cold clarity in my chest turned into something far sharper. I unlocked the device and opened the secure application to trace the origin of the fraud, stepping across an invisible threshold from which my family would never return. The glowing red banner on my smartphone screen commanded my undivided attention. As a senior financial auditor, I monitor my personal data with the same ruthless precision I apply to corporate ledgers. A sudden alert from a premier credit monitoring service usually indicates a minor administrative glitch or a delayed reporting metric. This notification was different. The text displayed across the dark glass did not indicate a routine soft pull or a background check. It explicitly stated a hard inquiry had just hit my credit report. Someone had successfully opened a new high-yield personal loan using my social security number. I stared at the illuminated pixels. The cold clarity that had settled in my chest just moments earlier morphed into something far sharper. The initial shock of my Tuesday eviction was a dull, heavy weight. This new revelation felt like a surgical blade. I unlocked the device and opened the secure mobile application. The dashboard loaded, displaying the fresh damage. I needed the raw, unfiltered data. I set the phone down and opened my laptop, bypassing the mobile interface entirely. I logged directly into the primary credit bureau web portal. I navigated through the security firewalls, verifying my identity through a dual authentication process, and requested the detailed trade line report. The system generated the document in seconds. The new account sat at the very top of the list, glaring like a neon sign in a dark room. It was an unsecured personal loan issued by a prominent online lender, known for lightning-fast approvals and predatory interest rates. The principal balance was exactly $14,000. The origination date was listed as Wednesday afternoon. I analyzed the timeline. Wednesday afternoon was barely 24 hours after Valerie stood in the foyer and ordered me to pack my belongings. My analytical mind immediately began breaking down the math. $14,000 is a very specific sum. It is not the kind of money someone borrows for a spontaneous vacation or a medical emergency. It is the exact amount required to cover the catering for a 60-person suburban gala. It covers the rush shipping on imported dresses. It pays for the elaborate floral arrangements and the live string quartet. Sutton needed a flawless aesthetic for her upcoming boutique launch party. Valerie needed her golden child to shine brightly in front of the neighborhood gossips. When I refused to wire the $1,200 car payment, they did not just accept my boundaries. They simply found a backdoor into my financial reservoir. I clicked the hyperlink provided by the credit bureau to view the specific origination documents. The online lender maintained a transparent portal for account holders to review their signed contracts. The digital paper trail unfolded before my eyes, laying out a timeline of brazen theft. The billing address listed on the loan application was the sprawling brick house in Plano. The contact phone number belonged to a prepaid cellular device I did not recognize. But the email address was the fatal flaw. It read Sutton Chic Launch at a popular free email provider. My younger sister had created a burner account specifically to intercept the confirmation messages and secure the funding for her boutique without triggering my primary inbox. I scrolled past the terms and conditions, past the exorbitant annual percentage rate, down to the electronic signature section. The online lender required a digital signature pad input for identity verification, meaning the applicant had to draw their name using a mouse or a touchscreen. I stared at the looping, distinctive cursive rendered in digital blue ink. The capital letter P in my first name was drawn with an exaggerated top-heavy curve. The lowercase letters slanted sharply to the right, ending with a dramatic, unnecessary flourish. It was not my handwriting. I knew those loops intimately. I had seen them 1,000 times before. It was the exact signature Valerie used on country club bar tabs. It was the handwriting she used to fill out charity gala reply cards. It was the script she used to sign birthday checks to her wealthy friends. My mother had forged my name. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with sickening precision. My mother and sister had executed a coordinated financial strike. Valerie provided the bold arrogance to commit the forgery, and Sutton provided the burner email to cover their tracks. They assumed I would never check my credit in the midst of a sudden career crisis. Or worse, they assumed that if I did find out, I would simply absorb the debt to keep the peace, just like I had absorbed every other financial burden they dropped on my shoulders over the past decade. They evicted me from my own property, but they kept my credit score. They harvested my identity on the way out the door. My years of eating packed lunches, driving a sensible sedan, and paying off my credit cards in full. Every month had built a flawless financial profile. Valerie exploited that pristine profile to secure instant approval from an online lender. I lifted my hands from the laptop keyboard. My fingers were trembling. It was not the tremor of a grieving daughter realizing her family did not love her. It was the physical manifestation of a terrifying, calculated focus. The final frayed tether connecting me to my childhood had snapped. My family had crossed a definitive line. They transitioned from toxic emotional neglect into outright federal crime. Taking out a personal loan under false pretenses is a felony. Forging a signature on a financial document is wire fraud. Identity theft is a severe criminal offense, punishable by years in prison. My mother had committed a severe crime, and my sister was the direct knowing beneficiary. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady hum of the hotel air conditioning unit. In my line of work, I frequently sat across from corporate executives who had embezzled company funds. I knew the psychology of a white-collar criminal. They always believe they are the exception to the rule. They rationalize their theft. Valerie undoubtedly convinced herself that she was entitled to my credit line because she gave birth to me. She likely viewed the $14,000 as a maternal tax I owed her for the privilege of growing up in her pristine house. She thought she was above the law because the victim was her own offspring. I opened my eyes. I pressed a keyboard shortcut to save the digital loan origination file, the signature capture, and the IP address logs directly to my encrypted hard drive. I created a new folder labeled Evidence. I did not feel the urge to cry. The betrayal was so profound, so audaciously cruel, that it bypassed my emotional receptors entirely and activated my professional survival instincts. The woman who stood in the foyer and ordered me to pack my garbage bags was no longer my mother. She was a hostile entity. The sister who complained about her car lease was no longer my sibling. She was an unindicted co-conspirator. They thought they had extracted the last bit of value from my existence. They thought throwing my clothes into contractor bags was the end of the transaction. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle their entire world. A mortgage default is a civil matter. It results in the loss of property. Identity theft is a criminal matter. It results in the loss of freedom. By stealing my social security number, they handed me the ultimate leverage. I picked up my smartphone. The screen was still dark, reflecting my own calm, determined expression. The time for tactical silence was over. The data collection phase was complete. It was time to initiate the audit. I scrolled through my contact list, bypassing the names of former colleagues and casual acquaintances until my thumb rested on a specific number. I pressed the green call icon, placed the device to my ear, and waited for my lead attorney to answer the phone. I pressed the green call icon and waited. Bennett answered on the second ring. His voice carried the crisp, professional cadence of a veteran litigator who spent decades dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He did not waste time with pleasantries. I outlined the exact timeline of the fraudulent application, keeping my delivery flat and factual. I detailed the creation of the burner email account used to bypass my security alerts. I described the digital forgery of my signature. Bennett processed the data instantly. His tone shifted from advisory into tactical mode. He suggested we file a formal police report right then and there. He noted we could have local detectives knocking on the front door of the Plano house before dinner time. It was the standard legal response to identity theft. I listened to his reasoning, looking out the hotel window at the sun, reflecting off the concrete parking garage. I shook my head, even though he could not see me. I refused the police option. I explained the reality of dealing with a woman like Valerie. My mother possessed a terrifying ability to manipulate authority figures. Throughout my childhood, I watched her talk her way out of traffic citations and neighborhood disputes by weaponizing her tears. If uniformed officers showed up at her doorstep, she would not confess. She would crumble into a practiced hysterical weeping fit. She would claim it was a simple misunderstanding. She would tell the officers that she had my verbal permission to secure the funds to help my struggling sister. Valerie would leverage her pristine tennis skirts and her affluent zip code to paint me as a vindictive, unemployed daughter seeking revenge. The authorities would view it as a messy domestic dispute rather than a federal crime. Bennett absorbed my assessment. He asked what my ultimate objective was. I told him I wanted my family to stand in the center of their fabricated reality and watch the walls collapse. I wanted an undeniable reckoning. We agreed to build a legal trap. I instructed him to draft a formal demand letter regarding the fraudulent loan, citing the specific criminal statutes they violated. I also told him to prepare the official notice of default on the mortgage. He was to keep both documents on his desk, ready to deploy the moment they made their next misstep. I was conducting a hostile audit, and their liabilities were about to severely exceed their assets. Thursday passed in quiet preparation. Friday morning brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of room 412. The stale scent of industrial carpet cleaner faded, replaced by the sterile hum of the air conditioning unit. I was sitting at the laminate desk, drinking a lukewarm cup of tap water, when my phone vibrated against the faux wood surface. The tactical silence was over. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message. The sender was Valerie. I picked up the device, expecting a carefully worded excuse regarding my abrupt eviction. Perhaps a passive comment about my lack of understanding. Instead, the message read like a court summons. Sutton's boutique launch party is Saturday. 60 guests. You need to be here. People will ask questions if you are absent. Do not ruin this evening for her. I read the text twice, letting the sheer audacity of the words settle into my mind. The specific number told the entire story of her motivation. 60 guests. The list would include the Homeowners Association president, the wives of my father's former business partners, and the elite members of her tennis club. Valerie did not care about the success of a clothing boutique. She cared about the audience. To my mother, perception was the only currency that mattered. A missing older daughter implied a fracture in the perfect suburban facade she worked tirelessly to maintain. A fractured facade was a tragedy far worse than a stolen identity. The psychological disconnect was breathtaking. Less than 48 hours ago, she harvested my credit score in the shadows to secure a $14,000 loan. Now she demanded I show up in the light, wear a smile, and serve as a human prop to validate her parenting in front of Plano society. She wanted to parade the victim of her felony at the very party funded by the crime. The hypocrisy rewired my understanding of her narcissism. She truly believed her social standing granted her immunity from consequence. I dialed Bennett again. I read the text message aloud to him, waiting for his professional assessment. He noted the fascinating psychological disconnect, but focused on the strategic value of attending. Bennett explained that white-collar criminals, especially arrogant ones, share a common fatal flaw. They talk. They justify their actions. They believe their own lies so deeply that they confess without realizing they are confessing. If I confronted them with a police officer, they would hire defense counsel and claim ignorance. But if I walked into a room filled with their peers, their guard would be down. Bennett advised me to attend the gala. He wanted me to maneuver them into verbally acknowledging the source of the launch party funding in a public setting. A digital signature can be disputed in a lengthy court battle. A public admission of guilt in front of neighborhood witnesses is an anvil. I would be the blank canvas, letting them paint their guilt all over it. I ended the call and opened the text thread with Valerie. I did not type out a long emotional response detailing my hurt. I did not ask her how she could sleep at night knowing she committed a felony against her own flesh and blood. I typed 4 letters. Okay. I pressed send. No punctuation. No follow-up questions. The brevity was a weapon all its own. It signaled compliance, ensuring she would let her guard down. She would interpret my short response as a quiet surrender, assuming the old dynamic was still securely in place. She had no idea the woman preparing to walk through her front door was no longer her dutiful daughter, setting the perfect stage for the corporate armor I was about to put on. I turned my attention away from the smartphone and looked toward the corner of the hotel room. My 3 black contractor bags sat slumped against the beige wallpaper, holding a chaotic, wrinkled mess of casual clothing. But my professional attire was protected. It hung separately inside a heavy canvas garment bag hooked over the closet door. I walked over and pulled the zipper down. I bypassed the floral dresses and soft pastel blouses. My hand reached straight for my favorite tailored charcoal blazer. The jacket was constructed from a structured, expensive wool blend. It featured sharp lapels and clean, unforgiving lines. I purchased it 3 years ago after securing my promotion to senior auditor. I wore this specific garment during high-stakes board meetings. I wore it on the day I had to slide a forensic accounting report across a mahogany table and tell a chief executive officer his enterprise was insolvent. The fabric was designed to project authority, competence, and cold truth. It was not a party outfit. It was corporate armor. I set up the cheap folding ironing board provided by the hotel. I filled the small iron with tap water and plugged it into the wall outlet. I spent 45 minutes pressing the blazer, a crisp white silk blouse, and a pair of dark slacks. The repetitive mechanical motion grounded my racing thoughts. Watching the steam rise and vanish into the dry air reinforced my internal focus. Every crease I smoothed out represented a tactical decision for the upcoming evening. As the iron glided across the dark wool, I visualized the contrasting scene unfolding miles away in Plano. Sutton was undoubtedly standing in front of a lighted vanity mirror right now. She was likely agonizing over contouring palettes and premium hair extensions. From a young age, my sister treated her physical appearance as her primary currency. While I spent my teenage years studying for advanced placement exams and building a resume, Sutton spent her time mastering angles, filters, and manufactured perceptions. She draped herself in whatever trendy aesthetic her latest credit card swipe could purchase. She dealt in fleeting illusions. I dealt in permanent facts. My wardrobe tonight needed to reflect the harsh reality of our respective situations. I hung the pressed suit on the closet door and stood in front of the full-length mirror. I closed my eyes and mentally mapped the battlefield. Walking into that gala required anticipating every defensive maneuver my adversaries might deploy. Valerie was the easiest variable to predict. My mother was a creature of intense vanity. She had invited 60 people to celebrate her parenting and her golden child. Those guests represented the pinnacle of local society. Therefore, Valerie would perform. She would greet me at the front door with practiced fake maternal warmth. She would likely attempt to hug me in front of the Homeowners Association president to prove our bond remained unbroken. She would pretend the eviction never occurred. She would act the part of the gracious, supportive host, expecting me to quietly play along and absorb her toxic theater. I had to brace my nervous system to accept her fake affection without flinching, without breaking character. Sutton was equally predictable. My younger sister possessed a desperate, bottomless need for the spotlight. The launch party was her grand debut as a fabricated entrepreneur. She would command the center of the room, raising a glass of expensive champagne to deliver a rehearsed speech about her difficult journey to success. She would demand undivided attention. I knew I simply had to stand in the shadows and let her inflate her own ego. The higher she elevated herself on that false pedestal, the farther the inevitable fall would be. But as I packed my leather tote bag with my essentials, a quiet realization settled over my analytical mind. Valerie and Sutton were predictable in their narcissism. The true wild card at this event would not be my mother or my sister. It would be my father. Richard was the silent enabler, the man who always wanted a piece of the pie without ever getting his hands dirty. He had watched his wife throw me out without saying a single word. He hid behind his magazine and let Valerie do the heavy lifting of my removal. But Richard never missed an opportunity to exploit a financial shift. I thought back to his history of fiscal mismanagement. He was a man who preferred shortcuts over hard labor. He relied on risky bridge loans to fund speculative ventures, nearly losing his own house in the process. He possessed a predator's instinct for locating unsecured capital. Richard knew I was laid off on Tuesday. In the corporate sector, a sudden departmental elimination at my seniority level always comes with a substantial severance package. My father possessed enough financial literacy to understand that a significant lump sum of cash had just landed in my checking account. He knew I was currently unemployed and vulnerable, but he also knew I was liquid. If I was going to survive Saturday night, I had to prepare for Richard to make a play of his own. He would not ask for a small favor. He would aim high. He would likely corner me away from the crowd, perhaps near the patio or the kitchen island. He would adopt his pragmatic patriarchal tone. He would present a new business venture or demand I co-sign a credit line for Sutton's boutique, attempting to legally chain my severance pay to their failing enterprise. He viewed my survival fund as an untapped asset ready to be deployed for his own comfort. Understanding his impending strategy eradicated any remaining traces of daughterly guilt. They were not inviting me back to mend fences. They were inviting me back to empty my pockets one last time. I stepped away from the mirror. I did not look like a dutiful child returning home to beg for forgiveness. I looked like a lead investigator preparing to execute a hostile raid. The sprawling brick house in Plano was no longer my childhood home. It was a compromised target. I was going to walk through their front door and conduct a total audit of my own family. However, entering enemy territory required more than just a pressed blazer and a tactical mindset. The trap I constructed with my attorney remained theoretical until the physical paperwork was finalized. I could not confront them with empty hands. I needed the legal ammunition fully loaded, signed, and registered into the federal postal system. I needed undeniable proof that their empire was crumbling. I set the alarm on my smartphone for 6 in the morning. Before the caterers arrived in Plano, before the string quartet tuned their instruments, and long before the sun set on Sutton's Grand Illusion, I had a crucial appointment. I needed to travel to the towering glass and steel structures of downtown Dallas. I needed to sit across a mahogany desk from my veteran litigator and sign the documents that would legally initiate their destruction. The corporate raid was scheduled for Saturday night, but the official declaration of war would be signed on Friday morning. Friday morning brought a harsh, bright light to the Dallas skyline. I steered my vehicle toward the towering glass and steel structures anchoring the downtown financial district. The Texas sun reflected sharply off the skyscrapers, casting long geometric shadows across the grid of the city. I navigated into a subterranean parking garage beneath a premier commercial high-rise. I parked my sedan, locked the doors, and walked toward the bank of elevators. I rode the car up to the 32nd floor, feeling the air pressure shift in my ears as I ascended far above the sprawling, chaotic traffic below. Bennett stood waiting for me in the lobby of his prestigious law firm. He was a veteran litigator, a man with silver hair and a perpetual expression of calm calculation. He wore a navy pinstripe suit and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who spent decades dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He guided me past a row of soundproof glass conference rooms and into his private corner office. The space was specifically designed to intimidate opposing counsel. It featured a sprawling mahogany desk, heavy leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the urban landscape. I took a seat opposite him. I did not ask for coffee. I did not engage in pleasant small talk. I placed my leather tote bag on the floor and looked directly at the man who held the legal keys to my parents' impending destruction. Bennett unclasped a thick manila folder and spread the contents across the polished wood surface. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It became clinical and highly focused. We were no longer discussing a messy domestic dispute. We were examining a systemic breach of contract. We started with the $14,000 personal loan. Bennett slid a freshly printed document toward me. It was a formal demand letter drafted on the heavy watermarked bond paper characteristic of his firm. The text was unforgiving. It outlined the exact timeline of the fraudulent application process. It detailed the creation of the burner email account utilized to bypass my security alerts. It specifically cited the digital forgery of my signature. The letter did not ask for a heartfelt apology. It demanded the immediate full repayment of the principal balance, plus all accrued interest. It explicitly stated that failure to remit the funds within a strict deadline would result in a direct referral to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. I read through the paragraphs, absorbing the heavy legal terminology. Wire fraud, identity theft, felony impersonation. Reading the words printed on official letterhead reframed the entire situation. Valerie always treated rules as mere suggestions. Throughout my childhood, I watched her return worn clothing to high-end department stores by swapping the price tags. She routinely parked in handicap spaces, claiming she was only running inside for a minute. She navigated her affluent suburban existence under the assumption that her tennis club membership granted her immunity from consequence. She applied that exact same arrogant logic to my social security number. She assumed that because she gave birth to me, my credit score was simply another household asset she could leverage for a party. The demand letter sitting on the mahogany desk was the first tangible boundary she could not manipulate or charm her way out of. Bennett watched me read. He tapped a silver fountain pen against his yellow legal pad. The demand letter is standard procedure. Bennett noted, his voice low and steady. It creates an undeniable paper trail proving we identified the fraud and gave them a narrow window to cure the defect. But the second document is where your true leverage exists. He moved the demand letter aside and produced a much thicker stack of paper. The header at the top read, Reynolds Heritage Trust. It was the official mortgage ledger for the brick house in Plano. Bennett pointed his pen at the most recent billing cycle. My eyes followed the dark ink to the columns representing the months of June and July. Both rows displayed a glaring string of zeros in the payment received column. Your parents missed their last 2 mortgage payments, Bennett explained quietly. I flagged the delinquency in the system earlier this week. It appears Richard decided to reroute his liquid cash elsewhere. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Richard had skipped 2 consecutive payments on a $680,000 loan. The timeline aligned perfectly with Sutton planning her extravagant boutique launch. My father deliberately diverted the money intended to secure a roof over their heads so his golden child could afford a live string quartet and racks of imported dresses. Richard possessed a fatal flaw common among arrogant men. He believed he could outsmart institutional systems. When the Reynolds Heritage Trust acquired his distressed debt 2 years ago, the trust presented itself as a faceless bureaucratic servicing company. Richard likely assumed that a giant corporate entity would not notice a missed payment or two. He figured he could float the debt stall the collections department with a few phone calls and catch up later when the boutique turned a profit. He bet his entire house on the assumption that his lender was slow and indifferent. He had no idea his lender was the daughter he just evicted. According to the restructured terms they signed, Bennett continued, leaning forward and lowering his voice. A 60-day delinquency triggers an automatic default clause. We are no longer required to offer a grace period or a forbearance plan. You possess the legal right to accelerate the note. You can demand the entire $680,000 balance immediately. When they inevitably fail to produce that capital, you can initiate formal foreclosure proceedings. Bennett slid the final piece of paper across the desk. It was a notice of default and intent to foreclose. This was the nuclear option. The document effectively ended their ownership of the suburban sanctuary. It authorized the seizure of the property, the scheduling of a public auction, and their legal eviction. The irony was exquisite. My mother threw my clothes onto the front porch on Tuesday. By signing this paper, I would authorize the county sheriff to do the exact same thing to her antique furniture. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. It required my authorization as the sole trustee of the Reynolds Heritage Trust. Bennett paused. The tapping of his pen ceased. The silence in the corner office stretched out heavy with the weight of impending ruin. He looked at me, his sharp eyes searching my face for any hesitation or lingering familial loyalty. I need to ask you this as your legal counsel, Bennett said carefully. Are you truly ready to pull the pin on this grenade? Once these documents enter the postal system, the chain reaction cannot be stopped without significant legal maneuvering. It will destroy their credit rating. It will likely destroy their marriage. They will lose the house. There is no going back to Sunday dinners after this. I turned my head and looked out the floor-to-ceiling window. The Dallas skyline sprawled out before me. Thousands of glass windows reflected the harsh midday light. Down on the streets below, cars moved in orderly, predictable lines. I felt the exact same pragmatic detachment I utilized during high-stakes corporate mergers. When a company is failing due to gross mismanagement and toxic leadership, you do not coddle the executives. You liquidate the assets and close the doors. I looked back at Bennett. I reached across the mahogany desk and picked up his silver fountain pen. They made me a financial instrument, I said, my voice steady and stripped of all daughterly affection. I am just adjusting the interest rate. I pressed the pen to the heavy bond paper and signed my name. I signed the demand letter. I signed the notice of default. My handwriting was sharp, efficient, and precise. There were no exaggerated loops or dramatic flourishes. It was the signature of an auditor closing a fractured ledger. Bennett gathered the signed documents. He folded them with meticulous care and slid them into thick, stiff cardboard envelopes bearing the distinct green tracking labels of United States Certified Mail. These envelopes required a physical signature upon delivery. Richard and Valerie would not be able to claim the letters were lost in transit or misplaced by a careless mail carrier. They would have to look a postal worker in the eye and sign for their own destruction. I will hold these in the mailroom until Monday morning, Bennett stated, tapping the sealed envelopes against the desk to align the edges. They will process through the regional sorting facility over the weekend. Your father will receive them next week. By the time he opens them, the party will be over. Perfect, I replied. I stood up from the leather chair. I felt lighter. The crushing weight of 31 years of subservience, guilt, and unrequited effort remained sitting on the mahogany desk inside those green-labeled envelopes. I picked up my leather tote bag and smoothed the front of my blouse. The trap was finalized. The legal ammunition was loaded. The machinery was officially in motion, grinding forward with quiet, invisible precision. All that remained was the performance. I left the high-rise office and took the elevator down to the subterranean garage. I drove my sedan back to the sterile hotel on the tollway. I needed to rest. I needed to preserve my energy. Tomorrow evening, I had to put on my charcoal blazer and walk into a house filled with 60 neighborhood guests. I had to look my mother in the eye while she paraded her stolen wealth. I had to listen to my sister brag about her fabricated success. And I had to watch my father pretend he was a titan of industry. I would let them build their glorious suburban stage, knowing I held the match that would burn it to the ground. Saturday evening descended on Plano, bringing a thick, humid twilight that wrapped heavily around the affluent neighborhood. I parked my practical sedan 3 blocks away from my parents' property. The wide circular driveway was already overflowing with luxury vehicles, forcing me to walk the remaining distance. Valet attendants in crisp red vests jogged back and forth, managing the constant influx of arriving attendees. My heels clicked a steady, rhythmic cadence against the concrete sidewalk. I wore my tailored charcoal blazer, my crisp white silk blouse, and dark slacks. I did not dress for a festive suburban celebration. I dressed for a corporate audit. As I approached the property, the visual spectacle came into full view. Warm white string lights were draped precisely through the branches of the ancient oak trees in the front yard. A catering van idled near the garage, its rear doors wide open as uniformed staff unloaded silver chafing dishes. The brick exterior of the house glowed under expensive landscape lighting. I paused at the edge of the manicured lawn, observing the staging ground. They had spared no expense for this performance. I walked through the heavy oak front door. The foyer hummed with the overlapping chatter of 60 local guests. No one noticed my quiet arrival. The air inside smelled of roasted garlic, expensive perfume, and fresh floral arrangements. I navigated through the crowd, recognizing the distinct demographics of my parents' social circle. The women from Valerie and her prestigious tennis club stood in tight clusters, wearing bright silk blouses and heavy jewelry. The men from Richard and his former business ventures gathered near the patio doors, swirling amber liquids in crystal glasses, discussing market trends they barely understood. I moved slowly, letting the sheer irony of the environment wash over me. I studied the gleaming hardwood floors beneath my feet. I looked up at the vaulted ceilings and the custom crown molding. I watched a neighbor run her hand admiringly along the smooth finish of the hallway wainscoting. These guests were praising a structure they believed belonged to Richard and Valerie. They had no idea the woman walking past them in a sharp business suit held the default notice for this very roof in a downtown mailroom. The guests were admiring a movie set, and I was the one who owned the studio. I stepped down into the sunken living room. Sutton was holding court in the center of the space. My younger sister was the undeniable focal point of the evening. She wore a floor-length emerald green gown. The silk fabric draped perfectly across her shoulders, catching the light as she moved. The dress was a limited edition piece from a European designer. I knew the retail price hovered around $2,000. I also knew exactly which digital signature paid for it. Sutton posed for photographs, laughing brightly, a flute of expensive champagne balanced in her manicured hand. A professional photographer circled her, snapping pictures for her social media feeds. She played the role of the successful young entrepreneur, flawlessly commanding the attention of everyone in her immediate radius. I walked past the living room and into the formal dining room, which had been temporarily converted into a showroom for Sutton and her new boutique. Chrome clothing racks lined the perimeter, displaying rows of dresses, blouses, and accessories. I ran my fingers along the fabric of a floral sundress. The material was thin and synthetic. The stitching was uneven. It was cheap imported inventory masked by strategic lighting and a high price tag. I audited the room in my mind. I counted the chrome racks. I noted the towering displays of white hydrangeas and pale pink roses. In the corner, a live string quartet played classical renditions of modern pop songs. The musicians wore matching black tuxedos. I added up the costs: the catering staff, the floral arrangements, The string quartet, the designer gown, the cheap inventory. The $14,000 personal loan was scattered across the physical space, repurposed into an illusion of success. I left the dining room and navigated toward the large kitchen island, seeking a glass of water. My mother was standing near the marble countertops. Valerie was in her element, thriving on the attention of her peers. She wore a tailored navy cocktail dress, her hair styled into an effortless, swept-up look. She was holding a chilled bottle of imported Prosecco, pouring a generous serving for a woman named Beatrice. Beatrice was the undisputed reigning gossip of the local homeowners association. I stopped a few feet away, partially obscured by a towering vase of fresh lilies. I picked up a plain glass and poured myself some sparkling water from a silver pitcher. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, designed to be heard by anyone standing close by. "The party is lovely," Beatrice murmured, her eyes scanning the room. "But where is Piper tonight? I heard she had a rough week at the accounting firm. Someone said her entire department was let go." Valerie did not miss a beat. Her posture remained flawless. She handed the brimming glass of Prosecco to Beatrice and offered a practiced, sympathetic sigh. It was the exact tone she used when absorbing someone else's crisis. "Oh, Piper is just transitioning right now," Valerie said, her voice smooth and dripping with false maternal concern. "You know how it is. She just does not have Sutton's entrepreneurial drive. Corporate life is so draining for her. We are giving her space to figure out her next steps." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The carbonation burned the back of my throat. I did not flinch. I did not step out from behind the floral arrangement to defend my work ethic. I simply stood there and absorbed the lie. My mother was using my career devastation as a foil to highlight her younger daughter's fabricated genius. She took a decade of my grueling 60-hour work weeks, my promotions, and my financial discipline, and reduced it all to a lack of drive. She painted me as a fragile, transitioning failure in order to protect the illusion of Sutton's success. She was securing her own social standing by feeding her eldest daughter to the neighborhood wolves. Beatrice nodded sagely, taking a sip of her Prosecco. "Well," the older woman replied, "it is a blessing you have Sutton. She is certainly going places." "She works so hard," Valerie agreed, beaming with pride. "She built this brand from the ground up. Built it from the ground up." The phrase echoed in my ears over the sound of the string quartet. Sutton had not built anything. She had hijacked my credit score, forged a signature, and ordered party supplies online. I set my glass of sparkling water down on the marble counter. I felt no urge to yell. I felt no urge to cry. The anger had burned away days ago, leaving behind a cold, unyielding resolve. I watched Valerie float away from the kitchen island, mingling with a group of country club wives. I watched Sutton laugh for the camera, her emerald gown sweeping across the hardwood floor. They were parading their fabricated success in a house I legally controlled, funded by a crime they committed against me. The audience of 60 guests remained blissfully oblivious, applauding an empire constructed on stolen paper. They were kept on the edge of their seats by the glittering facade, never realizing the ground beneath them was about to give way. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal blazer. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement, ready to navigate the rest of the evening. I scanned the crowded living room, mapping the exits and tracking the key players. That is when I saw him. My father was weaving his way through the clusters of chatting guests, his eyes scanning the room with a focused, urgent intensity. Richard was not mingling. I was hunting. And as his gaze finally locked onto my charcoal blazer, I knew the silent enabler was about to make his move. My father moved through the crowded kitchen with a practiced, effortless glide. Richard wore a custom-tailored navy suit that fit his shoulders perfectly, projecting the image of a seasoned executive. He carried a crystal tumbler filled with expensive scotch, the ice clinking softly against the glass as he walked. He did not stop to greet the neighbors or shake hands with his former colleagues. His eyes remained locked on my charcoal blazer. He navigated the room with the singular focus of a predator, zeroing in on a highly specific target. I stood my ground near the marble island. I did not retreat. I watched him approach, analyzing his body language. In my professional life, I frequently interviewed corporate officers suspected of embezzlement. I knew how to read the subtle tells of a man who needed something desperately, but wanted to appear fully in control. Richard set his tumbler on the counter. He leaned in close, invading my personal space to ensure our conversation remained private over the hum of the party chatter. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask where I had been sleeping for the past 4 days. He did not mention the heavy black garbage bags his wife had ordered me to carry out to my car. "Glad you decided to show up," Richard murmured, his voice low and transactional. "Listen to me closely. Sutton is establishing a limited liability company for her boutique. The bank requires a guarantor for her new business line of credit. I told her you would co-sign the paperwork since you have all that severance pay sitting in your account." I stared at him. The words hovered in the air between us, hanging over the scent of roasted garlic and fresh lilies. As a financial auditor, I spent my career dissecting risk. A business line of credit is a revolving loan. A guarantor is the individual who assumes 100% of the financial liability if the primary borrower defaults. My father was not asking me for a small favor. He was asking me to legally chain my future earnings to Sutton and her synthetic floral dresses. He had already calculated the value of my corporate severance package before the funds even cleared my checking account. I knew I was unemployed. He knew I had lost a six-figure income just days ago. He had watched me get thrown out of his house, yet his only instinct was to extract more capital from my bleeding wounds. I looked into his eyes, searching for a trace of shame. There was none. His expression was flat and expectant. He viewed my severance pay not as my survival fund, but as an untapped asset ready to be deployed for his own comfort. He wanted to use my financial safety net to subsidize his favorite child, insulating himself from any monetary risk while taking all the credit for facilitating the deal. "I was evicted, Dad," I stated clearly. I did not raise my voice, but I enunciated every syllable to ensure he heard the reality of the situation. Mom packed my belongings into trash bags on Tuesday afternoon and ordered me to find a hotel. "I do not live here anymore." Richard waved his hand in the air, a quick, dismissive gesture that brushed my trauma away like a pesky insect. "Do not be dramatic," he said, taking a sip of his scotch. "Your mother was just stressed about the launch party preparations. You know how she gets when she is hosting a large event. She overreacted. Just let the dust settle. Review the guarantor documents over the weekend and sign the papers on Monday, okay? Sutton needs the capital to expand her inventory. Do not be dramatic." Those 4 words echoed in my mind, shifting the foundation of my entire worldview. For my whole life, I had categorized my parents into 2 distinct roles. Valerie was the demanding, narcissistic architect of our family misery. Richard was the quiet, passive victim. I had always believed my father remained silent during our conflicts because he was trying to keep the peace. I thought he hid behind his magazines and his golf trips because he was afraid of Valerie and her explosive temper. Standing in that kitchen, the illusion shattered into pieces. Richard was not a hostage in his own marriage. He was the primary enabler. He outsourced his stress to me. He used his wife as an attack dog to enforce the family hierarchy, allowing her to do the dirty work of intimidation and eviction. Then he swooped in to collect the financial spoils, presenting himself as the reasonable, pragmatic dealmaker. His silence was never a defense mechanism. His silence was a weapon. By refusing to intervene when Valerie threw me out, he validated her cruelty. By demanding I sign over my severance pay to Sutton, he proved that my security meant nothing compared to his own convenience. If I co-signed that business line of credit, Sutton would inevitably default. The bank would seize my assets. Richard knew this. He simply did not care. He was willing to sacrifice my financial future to ensure Sutton remained occupied and Valerie remained happy. This interaction was the breaking point of the father and daughter bond. I felt the final fragile thread connecting us snap, severing decades of misplaced loyalty. There was no sudden rush of grief. There were no tears pooling in my eyes. When a toxic asset is finally removed from a ledger, the predominant feeling is relief. I looked at the man in the custom navy suit, and I no longer saw a parent. I saw a failing debtor who was trying to secure an unauthorized loan. I saw a man who had missed 2 consecutive mortgage payments on a $680,000 house, yet still had the audacity to demand my signature on a banking contract. I was standing on the deck of a sinking ship demanding I hand over my life preserver. "Well," Richard prompted, tapping his crystal tumbler against the marble countertop. "Can I tell your sister the paperwork will be handled?" I could have confronted him right there. I could have pulled the digital scan of the notice of default from my phone and shoved it in his face. I could have watched the color drain from his cheeks as he realized the anonymous trust holding his mortgage was controlled by the daughter he just called dramatic. I could have ended his facade in front of the caterers and the country club wives. But Bennett had given me strict instructions. Let them paint their own guilt. Let them build the stage. I looked at Richard. I offered him a slow, deliberate nod. It was a non-committal gesture, empty of any actual promise, but it was enough to satisfy his transactional mind. "We will discuss paperwork on Monday," I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral. Richard exhaled a self-satisfied smirk, touching the corners of his mouth. He interpreted my compliance as a victory. He assumed the old dynamic was still securely in place. The reliable, hard-working older sister would absorb the damage and fund the golden child. He picked up his scotch, gave me a brief approving pat on the shoulder, and turned his back on me to rejoin the wealthy men talking on the patio. I watched him walk away. I stored every detail of that brief conversation in my memory, filing it away as the final, unassailable justification for the legal avalanche currently sitting in the Dallas mailroom. They had earned every ounce of the ruin headed their way. My father thought he had just secured a revolving credit line. He had no idea he had just cemented his own eviction. I turned my attention back to the living room. The dynamic of the party was beginning to shift. The low hum of overlapping conversations quieted as a clear ringing sound echoed through the house. Sutton was standing on the second step of the grand sweeping staircase. She held a silver spoon, gently tapping it against the rim of her champagne flute. The live string quartet stopped playing in the corner of the dining room. The 60 guests turned their attention toward the golden child. Sutton smiled, her emerald gown catching the glow of the overhead chandelier. She waited for the room to fall completely silent before she prepared to deliver a speech. I remained near the kitchen island, adjusting my charcoal blazer. The trap was set, the audience was captive, and the main event was about to begin. The clear, ringing sound of silver striking crystal cut through the low murmur of the party. The live string quartet immediately lowered their bows, letting the final notes of the cello fade into the humid evening air. 60 pairs of eyes shifted away from their conversations and turned toward the grand staircase. Sutton stood on the second landing. She was elevated just enough to force every guest in the room to look up at her. The emerald silk of her designer gown draped flawlessly over the carpeted steps. She held her champagne flute high, a bright and practiced smile locked onto her face. My younger sister had always treated life like an ongoing theatrical production. When we were children, Valerie enrolled Sutton in every local pageant and theater camp available in North Texas. My mother spent countless hours coaching her on how to capture a room, how to find her lighting, and how to deliver a line with maximum emotional impact. Sutton never outgrew that training. She simply adapted it for adulthood. She thrived on having a captive audience, and tonight she possessed the largest one she had ever commanded. The guests quieted, turning their full attention toward the staircase. The men from Richard and his former business ventures ceased their discussions regarding stock portfolios. The women from Valerie and her elite tennis club shifted their weight, eager to absorb whatever performance the youngest Reynolds daughter had prepared. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Sutton began. Her voice projected beautifully, carrying a warm, inviting cadence. "This evening marks the culmination of a very long journey. Launching a luxury boutique is not easy. It requires sacrifice, dedication, and a willingness to build a dream from scratch." I stood near the marble kitchen island, listening to the syllables roll off her tongue. Build a dream from scratch. The phrase hung in the air, thick with undeniable irony. As a financial auditor, I spent my career dissecting the origins of capital. I knew exactly what her dream was built upon. It was not built on grit or late nights spent hunched over a sewing machine. Her boutique was constructed on a foundation of theft. The racks of clothing sitting in the dining room, the catering staff circulating with silver trays of appetizers, and the very dress she wore were all funded by a $14,000 personal loan. A loan secured by forging my digital signature. Her sacrifice consisted of nothing more than hijacking my credit score. She spoke of long nights of stressful vendor negotiations and of pouring her soul into a creative vision. The sheer audacity of her narrative was fascinating to witness. She was weaving a tapestry of hard work using threads stolen directly from my financial history. But the audience did not know the truth. They drank in her inspiring words. The country club wives murmured in admiration. Richard leaned against the archway of the living room, swirling the ice in his Scotch glass, nodding with the quiet pride of a patriarch who had financed an empire. Valerie stood near the front of the crowd, clasping her hands together over her heart, playing the role of the overwhelmed, supportive mother to perfection. There were moments when I wanted to quit. Sutton continued her tone, softening into a rehearsed vulnerability. There were immense obstacles in my path. But entrepreneurship is about overcoming those hurdles. It is about believing in your vision when no one else does. She paused, letting the audience absorb her fabricated struggle. Then the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The sweet, inspiring rhythm of her speech changed into something sharp and deliberate. Sutton lowered her glass slightly. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces drifting past the wealthy neighbors and the prominent business owners until her gaze locked directly onto my charcoal blazer. And tonight, I want to take a special moment to thank my older sister, Piper, Sutton announced. The crowd pivoted in unison. Dozens of faces turned toward the back of the room, searching the shadows near the kitchen island. I did not shrink away. I stood tall, my hands resting loosely at my sides, meeting the collective stare of 60 strangers. Many of you might not know this, Sutton projected, ensuring her voice reached the farthest corners of the patio. But Piper recently lost her job. Her entire department at the accounting firm was eliminated just a few days ago. A collective intake of breath rippled through the formal living room. The festive energy evaporated, replaced by a sudden heavy awkwardness. A few women exchanged shocked whispers behind their hands. Discussing unemployment in this specific Plano social circle was considered a severe social failure. It was the equivalent of bringing a contagious disease to a dinner party. But honestly, it is a great lesson for all of us, Sutton said. She offered a sad, patronizing tilt of her head. It is a profound lesson in karma. Sometimes when you are too focused on greed, when you spend your life obsessing over money and ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder instead of nurturing your family, the universe humbles you. The silence that followed was suffocating. People shifted their weight uncomfortably, the fabric of their formal wear rustling in the quiet house. Beatrice, the neighborhood gossip standing just a few feet away from me, cast a slow, pitying glance downward at my sensible shoes. The judgment in her eyes was palpable. I shifted my gaze from Sutton to my mother. Valerie was standing in the front row. She did not step forward to intercede. She did not raise a hand to stop her youngest child from executing this public humiliation. Instead, Valerie nodded in solemn agreement. Her face was molded into a mask of tragic acceptance, silently confirming the narrative that her eldest daughter was a greedy, soulless corporate drone who deserved to fail. The pieces of their strategy clicked together in my analytical mind. They were using my lowest professional moment as a stepping stone. Sutton was elevating her own narcissistic narrative by standing directly on my neck. By painting me as a ruthless, money-obsessed failure, she positioned herself as the spiritual, grounded, and successful entrepreneur. She was laundering her own insecurities through my misfortune. And Valerie supported it, because a humiliated Piper was a compliant Piper. They believed that by breaking my spirit in front of their peers, I would eventually fold. They assumed I would crawl back to them begging for scraps of their conditional affection, willing to co-sign whatever business loans they required just to regain entry into their good graces. They expected me to break. They expected my face to flush bright red with shame. They expected tears to well up in my eyes, forcing me to flee the house in embarrassment while the guests offered them sympathetic hugs. I gave them nothing. I remained perfectly still. My pulse maintained a steady, even rhythm. The ambient heat inside my chest, The same intense focus I utilized to untangle millions of dollars in corporate fraud solidified into pure, unyielding resolve. I did not look at the pitying faces of the neighbors. I kept my eyes locked on the woman standing on the staircase. Karma. Sutton had invoked the concept of cosmic justice. She claimed the universe was humbling me. She had no idea that the universe had outsourced the job directly to my legal counsel. Real karma was not losing a corporate job due to corporate restructuring. Real karma was realizing that the $1,200 luxury vehicle lease she demanded I pay was going into default the very next morning. Real karma was the realization that the $14,000 fraud she committed was being reported to the authorities on Monday. Real karma was the green certified mail envelope sitting in a downtown sorting facility, carrying the foreclosure notice for the very house where she currently stood. The stage they constructed was flawless. They had gathered their audience. They had delivered their lines. They had cast me in the role of the villain, oblivious to the fact that I held the script to the final act. The tension in the room reached its highest peak. The silence stretched until it felt fragile, ready to snap under the weight of the unspoken judgment. Sutton smiled, preparing to raise her glass to finalize the toast and cement her victory. I reached out and set my glass of sparkling water down on the smooth marble counter. The soft clink of glass against stone echoed in the quiet space. It was time to conduct the audit. I stepped away from the marble kitchen island. My sensible heels struck the polished hardwood floor, producing a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the lingering silence of the room. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a lead investigator entering a hostile boardroom. The clusters of wealthy neighbors and country club acquaintances instinctively parted, creating a clear physical path between the back of the house and the grand staircase where my sister stood. I reached the center of the sunken living room. I looked up at Sutton in her emerald silk gown. I did not raise my voice to a shout. I used the clear, projected tone I spent years perfecting during intense corporate negotiations. It was a frequency designed to command attention without projecting hysteria. I would love to add to that toast, I stated. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The live string quartet musicians shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, holding their bows awkwardly across their knees. Sutton maintained her frozen practiced smile, but her eyes flickered with a sudden, genuine uncertainty. She likely assumed I was about to apologize, to offer some tearful capitulation in front of her peers to save face. She expected the dutiful older sister to absorb the public shaming and beg for a return to the family fold. "You are very right about karma, Sutton," I continued, keeping my gaze locked firmly on hers. "The universe does have a unique way of keeping a balanced ledger. For instance, karma is realizing that the $1,200 luxury vehicle lease you demanded I pay on Tuesday is going into default tomorrow morning." The bright artificial smile vanished from Sutton's face. Her jaw went slack, the flute of champagne in her hand tilted dangerously, threatening to spill over the crystal rim. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words materialized. The realization that I had cut off her financial supply line was registering in real time, broadcasting live to her coveted audience. The golden child was suddenly faced with the terrifying prospect of funding her own existence. I did not give her a chance to recover. I pivoted smoothly, turning my attention to the front row of the crowd where my parents stood. Valerie was glaring at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, silent warning. Her posture was rigid. She was silently demanding I stop trying to exert the invisible maternal control she had weaponized throughout my entire childhood. I felt no obligation to obey. And karma, I projected, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the vaulted ceiling, is realizing that the $14,000 personal loan you fraudulently opened in my name on Wednesday afternoon is being reported to the authorities on Monday. A collective gasp echoed through the formal living room. The sound was visceral, a sudden vacuum of air, as 60 people absorbed the magnitude of the accusation. I received the credit alert at my hotel, I explained, maintaining my clinical, unyielding tone. I saw the burner email address you created. I viewed the digital forgery of my signature. You evicted me from this house, and less than 24 hours later, you hijacked my social security number to fund this launch party. The silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of quiet that only occurs when a carefully constructed reality shatters into irreparable pieces. Beatrice, the neighborhood gossip who had pitied my unemployment just moments earlier, stood frozen near the kitchen counter. Her fingers went limp. The delicate stem of her crystal wineglass slipped from her grasp. The glass struck the marble countertop with a loud, ringing clink, snapping the stem in half and sending a splash of pale liquid across the pristine surface. No one moved to clean it up. Valerie turned a ghastly shade of white. The blood drained from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking chalky and unnatural. Her hands, previously clasped over her heart in feigned maternal pride, fell limply to her sides. She opened her mouth, attempting to formulate a lie to spin a narrative that could save her social standing. She wanted to deploy her usual tactics to cry and claim a misunderstanding, but the sheer specificity of my accusation robbed her of any plausible deniability. I did not accuse her of being a bad mother. I accused her of a specific federal felony, complete with a date, a dollar amount, and a digital footprint. Hard data is immune to tears. I looked at Richard, the patriarch of the family, the man who had cornered me just 10 minutes earlier to demand I co-sign a business line of credit, was physically retreating. He took a slow, staggering step backward, bumping into a tall floral arrangement. A few drops of amber scotch spilled from his tumbler onto his custom navy suit. He realized the gravity of the situation instantly. He was an enabler who relied on the shadows, and I had just ignited a flare in the center of his living room. He knew the daughter he tried to hustle for a corporate severance package an hour ago was fully aware of the financial crimes committed under his roof. The guests began to look at one another, their expressions shifting from shock to deep, palpable discomfort. The women from the tennis club stared at the elaborate floral displays and the catered appetizers with sudden revulsion, calculating how much of the elegant evening was financed by stolen money. The men from the business community eyed my father with sharp, recalculating judgment. They were no longer guests at a high society celebration. They were witnesses standing in the middle of an active crime scene. I swept my gaze across the room, making brief eye contact with the various neighbors and acquaintances who had spent the last hour applauding an empire built on theft. I looked at the chrome clothing racks in the dining room and the expensive emerald gown draped across my sister. "Enjoy the Prosecco," I told the crowd, my voice calm and steady. It was purchased with a stolen identity. I did not wait for a response. I did not linger to watch my mother attempt to salvage her ruined reputation. I turned my back on the staircase, the emerald gown, and the weeping golden child. I walked toward the entryway. The sea of guests parted for me a second time, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. They pulled back to give me a wide berth, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and intimidation. I walked through the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the warm, humid Texas night. The sound of the heavy door clicking shut behind me signaled the end of my subservience. I walked down the long, winding driveway, passing the luxury vehicles and the catering van. My posture was straight. My breathing was even. For the first time in 31 years, I did not feel the crushing weight of my family and their endless expectations pressing down on my shoulders. I reached my practical sedan parked 3 blocks away. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel. I let out a long, slow exhale. The adrenaline of the confrontation slowly faded, replaced by a profound, settling peace. I inserted the key into the ignition and started the engine. I drove away from the affluent suburban neighborhood, leaving an inferno of social humiliation burning in my wake. I knew the fallout inside that house would be catastrophic. Valerie would undoubtedly try to blame Sutton for needing the expensive party. Sutton would scream at Richard for not protecting her image. Richard would retreat to his recliner and pour another drink, furious that his financial safety net had grown teeth and severed the cord. They were currently enduring the worst night of their lives. They believed the public exposure of the $14,000 fraud was the ultimate consequence of their actions. They thought the nightmare was over. But as I merged onto the tollway heading back to my quiet hotel room, a faint, pragmatic smile touched my lips. My parents were oblivious to the true scale of their impending ruin. They were agonizing over a minor personal loan, completely unaware of the legal avalanche silently winding its way through the United States postal system. The trap had successfully closed around them. The audience had witnessed the preliminary audit. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the mail carrier to deliver the final fatal blow. 7 days from tonight, a green certified envelope would arrive on their doorstep, carrying the official notice that the daughter they discarded now held the deed to their entire world. A full 5 days had elapsed since I walked out the front door of that suburban fortress, 120 hours of deliberate, calculated quarantine on my end. Following the spectacular collapse of Sutton and her fabricated launch party, I packed my sedan and drove 300 miles south. I secured a short-term executive rental in downtown Austin. The relocation provided a necessary geographic boundary. Plano represented a theater of illusions, a place where perception consistently outweighed reality. Austin offered a blank slate far removed from the country club gossip network and the toxic ecosystem my mother meticulously curated. It was Thursday afternoon. I sat at a small corner table inside a sleek glass-walled coffee shop overlooking the Colorado River. The ambient noise of the cafe offered a soothing rhythm. Espresso machines hissed, ceramic mugs clinked against saucers, and patrons engaged in quiet, productive conversations. I opened my laptop and connected to the secure wireless network. I was not updating my resume or searching for new corporate auditing positions. I was refreshing a tracking portal for the United States Postal Service. I knew my father's routine perfectly. Richard always checked the mail at precisely 2 in the afternoon, right after he finished his post-lunch beverage. The digital tracker on my monitor showed a certified package was currently out for delivery in his specific zip code. I watched the status bar with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. At 2:14 in the afternoon, the progress bar shifted from yellow to bright green. The text updated, delivered, signature acquired. Sitting in that sunlit cafe, surrounded by the scent of roasted coffee beans, I pictured the exact sequence of events unfolding 300 miles away. I saw the scene with crystalline clarity. Richard walking down his long, manicured driveway, wearing his expensive leather loafers. The postal carrier, handing him the rigid, stiff cardboard envelope bearing the distinct green tracking label. My father signing the digital pad, likely annoyed by the minor inconvenience interrupting his leisure time. He would assume the envelope contained a routine tax document, a boring municipal notice, or perhaps a revised vendor contract for the new boutique. He would carry the envelope back inside, retreating to his leather recliner in the living room, the very same recliner where he sat hiding behind a glossy magazine while his wife packed my life into garbage bags. He would set his crystal tumbler on the side table. He would slide a silver letter opener through the heavy cardboard flap, breaking the seal. He would pull out the thick stack of legal documents prepared by Bennett. The first page he encountered was the formal demand letter regarding the $14,000 identity theft. The language on that page was brutal and precise. The threat of criminal prosecution would rattle him, confirming that my public display at the gala was not an empty threat. But Richard always viewed Valerie and her schemes as separate from his own liabilities. He was a master of compartmentalization. He would assume he could isolate himself from the forgery, perhaps even planning to throw his wife under the bus to save his own reputation. Then he would flip to the second document, the notice of default and intent to foreclose. The heavy bond paper held the true weight of their impending destruction. I visualized his eyes scanning the crisp black ink. He would read the bold header at the top of the page, Reynolds Heritage Trust. I knew the name of the entity holding his mortgage. He had celebrated its anonymous intervention 2 years ago, bragging to his affluent friends about the generous restructuring deal he secured from a faceless corporate servicer. I thought he was a brilliant negotiator who outsmarted the banking system, but he had never seen the signature of the primary trustee. His gaze would drift down the dense paragraphs of legal jargon, past the acceleration clause, past the specific dollar amount of $680,000. He would search the bottom of the page for the authorized representative who was threatening to seize his property due to a 60-day delinquency. He would see my name. Piper Reynolds, signed in sharp, unforgiving black ink. The horrific realization would dawn on him in a slow, suffocating wave. The anonymous corporate savior he bragged about was a phantom, the entity that owned the roof over his head, the walls enclosing his suburban sanctuary, and the very hardwood floors his wealthy guests walked upon, was his eldest daughter. The daughter he allowed his wife to evict. The daughter he cornered in a kitchen to demand she co-sign a risky business loan. The daughter they publicly humiliated, mocked, and financially exploited for a decade. He had missed 2 consecutive mortgage payments because he assumed a giant bureaucratic bank would not notice or care. He diverted his housing funds to pay for a string quartet and imported floral arrangements. Now he was staring at legal proof that his lender was the exact person whose boundaries he had spent a lifetime trampling. The illusion of his wealth evaporated in an instant. His custom navy suits, his expensive liquor, and his pristine lawn were all built on my silent charity. By throwing me out on Tuesday afternoon, they did not rid themselves of a financial burden. They handed an eviction notice to their own landlord. Richard was a man who prized leverage above all else. He operated on the belief that he held the superior hand in every relationship. In that singular moment, sitting in his quiet living room, with the certified mail resting on his lap, he would realize he possessed zero leverage. His entire existence was contingent upon my mercy, and he knew exactly how much mercy I had left. I took a slow sip of my iced beverage. The bitter flavor grounded me in the present moment. I did not feel a rush of vindictive joy. I felt the steady, methodical satisfaction of an auditor who had successfully balanced a fractured ledger. My smartphone resting on the table next to my keyboard began to vibrate. The low, kinetic hum resonated through the cafe setting. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a single word: Dad. For nearly a decade, seeing that name illuminate my device would have triggered an immediate physiological response. My stomach used to drop. My heart rate would accelerate. A call from my father always signaled a financial emergency, a demand for capital, or a subtle guilt trip regarding my lack of familial dedication. I would have scrambled to answer, eager to prove my worth by solving whatever crisis he presented. Today, my pulse remained steady. I did not reach for the phone. I sat and watched the device dance across the table's surface. The screen eventually went dark, logging the first missed connection. 30 seconds later, the screen illuminated again. The vibration resumed, then a third time, then a fourth. The digital onslaught was relentless and unprecedented. Richard never initiated repeated phone calls. Throughout my entire adulthood, my father utilized communication as a tool of passive dominance. He expected others to reach out to him. If he needed something, he instructed Valerie to make the request, while he remained insulated from the messy reality of confrontation. Seeing him break his lifelong pattern of avoidance proved the certified mail had detonated precisely on schedule. The bombardment continued for a full 60 minutes. Call 12. Call 13. By call 16, the battery icon on my screen dipped from the constant exertion of the vibration motor. The man who sat in his leather recliner for years, refusing to engage in any household conflict, was suddenly desperate to bridge the distance. Each unanswered ring represented a crumbling pillar of his suburban fortress. He was drowning. He knew I was the only person holding a lifeline. He was pursuing me rather than forcing me to chase his approval. On the 17th ring, I reached out and swiped the green icon to accept the connection. I lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply breathed, letting the open channel transmit the quiet, controlled atmosphere of the coffee shop into his chaotic reality. "Piper, what is this?" Richard demanded. "Yes, Richard." The voice transmitting through the speaker lacked its usual deep, patriarchal resonance. It was high, reedy, and frantic. It was the sound of a man looking directly into a financial abyss. The polished country club executive had vanished, replaced by a terrified debtor. "It is a notice of default," Richard replied. The deliberate omission of the word dad hung in the digital space between us. Dropping that title was a verbal severance. It reclassified our relationship from familial to strictly contractual. I stripped away the biological connection they had weaponized against me, replacing it with the cold reality of our legal standing. Richard choked on a breath. I heard the crisp rustle of heavy bond paper in the background. He was physically holding the certified documents, How did you get this? He stammered, his words tripping over each other in his haste. The trust. The bank said a private trust bought the note 2 years ago. How is your name on this paper? Before I could explain the mechanics of distressed debt, a shrill, piercing sound cut through the background of the call. Valerie was screaming. Her voice was unhinged, stripped of all her refined suburban polish. What did she do? My mother shrieked, her tone echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the Plano house. Richard, what does that paper say? Tell me what she did. I kept my breathing steady. I channeled the flat, unyielding tone of a third-party collections agent. I removed all trace of the daughter they had raised to be a financial shock absorber. You kicked the legal owner of your house to the curb on Tuesday afternoon. I stated, my voice cutting through the chaotic background noise with surgical precision. You are currently 2 months behind on your restructured mortgage payments. Instead of paying your lender, you committed wire fraud to finance a boutique launch party. The grace period expired. The terms are no longer negotiable. She cannot do this! Valerie screamed, her voice distorting the audio feed. Tell her she cannot do this. Call the police. She is stealing our house. She is ruining Sutton. Richard did not comfort his wife. He did not agree with her frantic demands. He knew the police could not arrest a primary lien holder for enforcing a legal contract. He also knew the authorities would be highly interested in the $14,000 forged personal loan. The trap Bennett and I built was airtight. Richard possessed enough financial literacy to recognize a checkmate when he saw one. He knew they had zero legal recourse. Piper, please, Richard begged. The word sounded foreign and unnatural in his mouth. He was unaccustomed to pleading. You cannot do this to us. We are family. You do not treat family this way. The hypocrisy of his statement provided the final necessary closure I needed. He invoked the concept of family only when he was the one facing the consequences of an eviction. When Valerie packed my belongings into garbage bags, family meant nothing. When Sutton demanded my severance pay, family meant nothing. When they forged my digital signature, family meant nothing. They only remembered we were related when the bill came due. I pictured Sutton standing on the staircase in her emerald gown, preaching about cosmic justice to a room full of wealthy neighbors. I let a long, heavy pause settle over the line, ensuring my next words would land with maximum devastating impact. Do not feel bad, Richard, I said, mirroring the exact phrasing Sutton used during her toast. It is just karma. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the red button terminating the connection. The screen went dark. I picked up my phone and drafted a single email to my father. I informed him that any further communication would be conducted through my legal counsel. I demanded they arrive at the downtown law firm on Monday morning to discuss the terms of their surrender. If they failed to appear, the foreclosure auction would be scheduled, and the criminal complaint regarding the forgery would be filed before noon. I hit send. The balance of power had permanently shifted. The trap was sprung, and I was ready to watch them face the consequences of their own design in a soundproof glass room. The following Monday morning arrived with a pale, overcast sky. The punishing Texas heat was temporarily subdued by a thick layer of gray clouds, perfectly matching the clinical atmosphere inside the downtown Dallas law firm. I sat in a high-backed leather chair inside a corner conference room. The walls were constructed entirely of soundproof glass. The surface of the long table was a slab of cold, polished granite. Bennett sat to my right. He wore a charcoal suit that mirrored my own tailored blazer. He spent the previous 20 minutes organizing 3 distinct stacks of legal paperwork. The pages were aligned with geometric precision. A silver fountain pen rested horizontally across the top document. The environment was meticulously designed to strip away emotion and replace it with stark, undeniable reality. We were not gathering for a heartfelt reunion. We were convening for a corporate surrender. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy wooden door clicked open. The receptionist ushered my family into the room. I studied them as they crossed the threshold. The physical deterioration they exhibited was profound. Just 2 days ago, they hosted a lavish suburban gala radiating entitlement and fabricated wealth. Today, they looked like hollow shells. Richard walked in first. He wore a rumpled gray suit that seemed a full size too large for his frame. His shoulders were slumped. The deep creases around his eyes were pronounced, mapping a weekend filled with sleepless panic. Valerie followed close behind him. She was unrecognizable. The polished country club matriarch who always smelled of premium lavender room spray and wore crisp tennis skirts had vanished. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, severe knot. She wore a plain beige cardigan and avoided making eye contact with anyone in the room. She stared intently at the granite floor, clutching her leather purse like a protective shield. Sutton brought up the rear. My younger sister wore oversized dark sunglasses indoors, attempting to hide her swollen red eyes. She was draped in a baggy cashmere sweater, looking fragile and terrified. The golden child was finally stepping out of the protective bubble her parents had inflated, and the exposure to the real world was clearly traumatizing her. They moved toward the opposite side of the long table. They hesitated, waiting for an invitation to sit. I gave them nothing. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer a polite hello. The power dynamic was entirely reversed, and I intended to establish the new hierarchy through sheer stillness. Richard pulled out a chair for Valerie, then sank heavily into the seat across from me. Sutton sat next to her mother, pulling her sweater tightly around her shoulders. The silence in the soundproof room was deafening. The only noise was the faint rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning system. Richard cleared his throat. He placed his hands flat on the granite table. He attempted to muster a fraction of his former patriarchal authority. Piper Richard began, his voice raspy and unsteady. "We need to figure this out. We are your family. We can handle this internally without involving lawyers." I did not let him finish the thought. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "We are not here to figure anything out, Richard," I stated coldly. "We are here to finalize the terms of your default." The era of handling things internally ended the moment Mom packed my life into garbage bags and forged my signature. Valerie flinched at the word forged, her eyes darting toward Bennett. She was terrified of the attorney. Bennett remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, acting as the silent enforcer of my boundaries. "Here are the conditions," I said, my voice projecting across the cold stone table. "I have drafted 3 separate agreements. You will sign all 3 today, or you will leave this building and face the legal consequences by nightfall." I reached for the first stack of paper and slid it across the granite surface until it rested in front of Valerie. Condition 1, I declared. "This is a formal confession of judgment regarding the $14,000 personal loan. By signing this document, you legally admit to committing identity theft and wire fraud. You agree to repay the principal balance in full plus an 8% interest rate directly to the lender. If you miss a single installment, or if you refuse to sign this today, Bennett will hand the digital evidence over to the district attorney and he will file a police report before lunchtime." Valerie stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Her hands trembled. She looked at Richard silently, begging him to intervene to negotiate a softer landing, but Richard kept his eyes glued to his own hands. He had no leverage to offer. He could not save her. I pulled the second stack of paper toward the center of the table. Condition 2. I continued, shifting my gaze to my father. "This is the restructured mortgage agreement for the Plano house. The Reynolds Heritage Trust is formally accelerating the note due to your 60-day delinquency. However, I am offering a final forbearance plan. Your new monthly payment is calculated with a strict zero-tolerance policy. The funds are due on the 1st of every month. There is no grace period. If a payment is 1 day late, the forbearance is revoked and the foreclosure auction is scheduled immediately." Richard swallowed hard. The prominent vein in his neck pulsed. He was a man who spent his life floating debts and bending rules, surviving in the gray areas of financial contracts. I was removing the gray areas entirely. I was placing him inside a rigid, unforgiving box. I picked up the final document and slid it toward my younger sister. Sutton shrank back in her chair, moving away from the white pages. "Condition 3, I said, my tone flattening into a sharp, unyielding blade. "Sutton, you no longer live in that house rent-free. You are 27 years old. You operate a business out of the guest room. This is a standard commercial and residential lease agreement. You will pay fair market value directly to the trust for the square footage you occupy. The first month's rent is due upon signing. If you cannot afford it, you have until Friday afternoon to vacate the premises. The words hit Sutton like a physical strike. Her mouth fell open. For her entire life, her primary occupation was simply existing. She had never faced a utility bill, a lease agreement, or a concrete financial expectation. The concept of paying for her own shelter was entirely foreign to her. "I cannot pay rent!" Sutton gasped, her voice cracking. She ripped her dark sunglasses off her face, revealing eyes brimming with fresh tears. "My boutique just launched. All my capital is tied up in inventory. You know that." "Your capital is tied up in stolen funds," I corrected her. "That is not my problem." Sutton burst into theatrical sobs. She turned to Valerie, clutching her mother's arm, desperately seeking the human shield that had protected her since childhood. "Mom, please," Sutton cried, her voice echoing shrilly in the glass room. "Tell her I cannot do this. Tell her to stop. She is trying to ruin me." It was the exact same tactic she had used on Tuesday afternoon when she demanded I pay her car lease. She expected Valerie to unleash a torrent of guilt and manipulation to force my compliance. I watched Valerie closely. My mother looked at her weeping golden child. Then she looked at the confession of judgment sitting on the table. She looked at Bennett, who was calmly unscrewing the cap of his silver fountain pen. Valerie had nothing left. Her arsenal was empty. She could not threaten me with eviction because I owned her house. She could not shame me in front of the neighbors because her own reputation was currently burning to ash. She was entirely and profoundly powerless. My mother slowly pulled her arm away from Sutton's grasp. She did not offer a word of comfort. She picked up the silver fountain pen. Her hand shook as she pressed the nib to the signature line on the confession of judgment. She signed her name legally, binding herself to the theft. The sound of the pen scratching against the heavy paper was the only noise in the room, cutting through the sound of Sutton's muffled sobbing. Richard reached for the pen next. He pulled the restructured mortgage agreement toward his chest. He signed his name with a quick, defeated scrawl. He did not look up. He did not ask for forgiveness. Sutton was the last to sign. She realized no one was coming to rescue her. She took the pen, her tears staining the crisp white pages of the lease agreement, and signed away her free ride. I reached across the granite table and collected the documents. I checked each signature for accuracy. I tapped the edges of the paper against the table to align them perfectly, then slid the stack into my leather briefcase. I fastened the brass clasps. The metallic click echoed with finality. I looked at the three people sitting across from me. I expected to feel a surge of triumph. I thought watching them face accountability would provide a rush of vindication. Instead, I felt a deep, hollow ache. I did not smile. This was not a victory. It was a necessary amputation. I was cutting off a diseased limb to save the rest of my life. The transaction was complete, the ledger was balanced, and the familial bond was permanently severed. I stood up from my chair, ready to walk out of the glass room and leave them behind in the wreckage of their own making. 3 months had passed since the heavy glass door of the downtown Dallas conference room clicked shut behind my family. The Texas autumn arrived, bringing a crisp, welcome chill to the morning air. I stood on the private balcony of my new high-rise condominium in downtown Austin. The Colorado River carved a dark, winding path through the center of the city, catching the early sunlight and scattering it across the glass facades of neighboring buildings. I gripped my favorite ceramic coffee mug, the very same mug I had carried out of the Plano house inside a cardboard box. The roasted blend tasted rich, unburdened by suburban toxicity. Relocating hundreds of miles south was a tactical decision. Plano represented a theater of illusions. Austin offered a blank slate. I secured a new position as a senior forensic accountant at a prestigious tech firm, a role that rewarded my analytical mind rather than exploiting it. The generational cycle of financial subservience and emotional manipulation was officially broken. I was no longer the designated shock absorber for their reckless decisions. I breathed in the cool air, feeling a profound lightness settle into my bones. My smartphone chimed with a crisp, professional notification. It was a secure email from Bennett. My attorney provided a concise, bulleted update regarding the Reynolds Heritage Trust. The report was clinical and highly satisfactory. For the third consecutive month, Richard remitted his restructured mortgage payment exactly on time. The funds cleared the escrow account 3 days before the first of the month. Fear proved to be a far more effective motivator than familial duty. My father finally understood that the leniency he enjoyed under the guise of anonymity was permanently revoked. One late payment meant immediate foreclosure, and he operated under the crushing weight of that truth every single day. Furthermore, the first 3 installments for the forged personal loan had been deposited, plus the required interest. Richard was currently working a second job as a consultant for a mid-sized logistics firm to cover the financial shortfall, trading his leisurely golf afternoons for 60-hour workweeks. Bennett also included a brief addendum regarding the commercial and residential lease agreement for the guest room. Sutton was technically current on her rent, but her fabricated entrepreneurial empire had collapsed under the weight of actual obligations. Without my credit score to subsidize her aesthetics, the boutique folded in less than 6 weeks. Her imported dresses were liquidated at a steep loss to cover her outstanding vendor invoices. The most striking detail involved her transportation. The $1,200 luxury vehicle lease she demanded. I went into default shortly after the launch party. The bank repossessed her pristine SUV from the Plano driveway in broad daylight, right in front of Beatrice and the neighborhood gossips. Sutton currently drove a 10-year-old sedan and worked 40 hours a week at a high-end retail clothing store in a local mall. The golden child was finally learning the true cost of survival, forced to fold sweaters and assist customers who lived the lifestyle she once pretended to own. The poetic justice of her current occupation was not lost on me. She spent her youth demanding service. Now her livelihood depended on providing it. The structural changes in their lives were profound, but the behavioral patterns of my mother proved stubborn. Valerie still attempted to breach the perimeter. Every few weeks, a text message bypassed my silent notifications. She never apologized for the identity theft. She never acknowledged the garbage bags in the foyer. Instead, she utilized the weapon of manufactured nostalgia. She sent photographs of old family vacations accompanied by guilt-inducing captions about missing her eldest daughter. She wrote lengthy paragraphs lamenting how quiet the house felt, framing herself as the tragic victim of a fractured family unit. She complained about the neighbors distancing themselves, playing the martyr to an audience of one. In the past, those messages would have ruined my entire week. I would have agonized over the exact phrasing of a reply, trying to balance self-respect with a desperate desire for maternal validation. Now I read her texts with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a primitive defense mechanism. I did not type a response. I did not engage. I simply archived the messages and placed the phone back on the counter. The deadbolt was firmly engaged. I had constructed a fortress of my own built on hard-earned capital and unyielding boundaries. Standing on the balcony, feeling the crisp wind against my face, I recognized that true wealth had nothing to do with trust funds or corporate salaries. True wealth was the absence of dread. It was the ability to wake up on a Saturday morning without bracing for a financial crisis. It was the profound relief of knowing my utility was no longer the sole metric of my worth. The hundreds of thousands of dollars I had poured into their endless demands over the previous decade was a steep tuition, but it purchased my ultimate freedom. I watched a flock of birds bank sharply over the river, moving in perfect unison. My family had expected me to absorb their failures forever. They designed a system where my competence funded their negligence. By enforcing the terms of their own contracts, I forced them to live within the confines of reality. I turned away from the skyline and looked inside my condominium. The space was bright, minimalist, and entirely mine. There were no contractor garbage bags waiting in the hallway. There were no designer dresses cluttering the guest quarters. My ceramic mug rested on a smooth quartz countertop. I had decorated the living area with art I chose, books I wanted to read, and furniture paid for with honest earnings. The environment was a physical manifestation of my newly reclaimed autonomy. When the doorbell rang, I did not brace myself for a demand. I welcomed friends who valued my intellect, my humor, and my presence. My new social circle did not care about my financial portfolio. They cared about my character. I stepped back to the edge of the balcony, resting my hands on the cool metal railing. I looked down at the vibrant, bustling streets of Austin. The journey from the suburban toxicity of Plano to this quiet altitude required stepping through a gauntlet of betrayal. But surviving that gauntlet provided a perspective I needed to share. I turned my attention away from the city and looked directly at you, the person listening to this story. You might be sitting in a parked car, dreading the moment you have to walk into a family gathering. You might be staring at your own bank statement, calculating how much you need to wire home to keep the peace. You might be shrinking yourself to ensure someone else can shine. You might believe that if you just sacrifice a little more, they will finally see your inherent value. I am here to tell you that conditional affection is a debt you can never repay. A boundary is not a wall, it is a door with a lock. And I finally realized I am the only one holding the key. If you are still waiting for your family to love you for who you are, rather than what you provide, type my turn in the comments. I read every single one. You do not need a trust fund to take your life back. You do not need a law degree or a dramatic public confrontation. You just need the courage to walk out the door. The cost of conditional affection. There is a deeply ingrained script in American culture that tells us success is the ultimate equalizer. We are raised on the promise that if we just work hard enough, climb high enough, and earn enough, we will eventually secure the respect and love we inherently crave. We buy into the suburban dream, the manicured lawns, the sprawling brick houses, and the neighborhood parties glittering with warm string lights. We are taught that family is our ultimate sanctuary, a safe harbor from a ruthless corporate world. But what happens when you discover that your sanctuary is actually a toll booth, and your personal value is weighed entirely by what you can financially provide? The story of Piper Reynolds is not just a tale of corporate leverage or a dramatic family fallout, it is a profound reflection on the transactional nature of conditional love in a culture that frequently commodifies success. When Piper was handed garbage bags instead of sympathy, on the worst day of her professional life, she experienced a brutal awakening that resonates with countless unspoken stories across the country. In America, rugged individualism is celebrated. Yet we are simultaneously bound by a quiet, crushing guilt to lift our families up alongside us, regardless of the personal cost to our own well-being. How many of us have acted as the human shock absorbers for our families? How many of us have subsidized the golden child, paid the silent debts of our parents, and mistaken their relentless reliance on our wallets for genuine affection? We are trained to be the reliable ones, quietly absorbing the emotional and financial damage, so the family portrait remains flawless for the rest of the world to see. But there comes a defining moment when the ledger must be balanced. In a society that glorifies the relentless hustle, the bravest thing you can do is abruptly stop working for a love that should have been given freely. It is terrifying to realize that the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones harvesting your identity. Yet there is a profound liberation in auditing your own life. It requires stepping back, looking at the sinking ship of your family's expectations, and realizing you are under no obligation to hand over your life preserver. Taking back your power does not require a secret trust fund or a dramatic legal checkmate. Sometimes it simply requires the courage to stop answering the frantic phone calls, to pack your bags on your own terms, and to walk out the front door. We all have our own version of that Plano house, a place where we perform demanding roles we never actually auditioned for. If you are currently navigating your own complex family dynamics, or if you simply find comfort in narratives about reclaiming your personal autonomy, please take a moment to follow our channel, Calm Senior Stories. We share these journeys because you deserve to know that you are not walking this difficult path alone. The hardest part of setting an unyielding boundary isn't turning the lock. It is learning to live in the quiet space that follows. When the chaotic demands finally stop, the sudden silence can feel overwhelming. You stand in your new life looking out at a horizon that belongs entirely to you, and you realize that true peace often carries a subtle, lingering grief. You are safe, you are free, and you hold the only key. But as you watch the sun set, casting long shadows across your own hardwood floors, you cannot help but stare at your heavy front door and wonder if the people you left behind will ever truly understand